Of course, we're going to see both colonial architecture and colonial furniture. And here we're focusing on the Spanish colonial style in Latin America, which is going to be different than what we're going to see in North America. Now, much of what they're doing is borrowing ideas that are popular in Spain at the time and bringing them to the New World. In this case, they will create something called the Plateresque style. And it's named because it's reminiscent of the etched silver platters that were so popular at the time, but it's a very Baroque style. This is something that's happening between about 1521 and about 1600. So we're at the end of the Renaissance, the early Baroque period. And of course, we see that here. So you end up with a highly sculptural, very busy, very arabesque style of decoration. So we see the use of acanthus, we see the use of architectural elements, niches with sculpture. Here's a seashell form. These forms are very, very common when you get to the churches of Mexico during this period, during this early colonial period. And as they're trying to explain this, of course, the Spanish aren't actually building it. There aren't enough of them to do that. And they're not there to build anyway. They're there to be rich landowners. So you have indigenous artisans that are being given the design and then asked to do it, which is why you get something that is a little bit bigger and a little bit clumsier than what you might see in Europe, because they're simply not used to that style. It's not that they can't do it, it's that they've never done it before. And it is mimicking some of the style that we see amongst the indigenous Aztec, for example. So what you see is a lot of detail where it is either raised or lowered. It is very binary. There isn't a lot of transition like you would see in typical European relief. And that's because that is their style. That is what they are used to in Mesoamerica. When you create sculpture, it's kind of like creating three-dimensional drawing. You're creating flat planes and then you're dropping that background back. But there's no real transition. For example, into the sides and ultimately into the back. We are going to see a lot of architecture, and there are two real big ideas with Spanish colonial architecture. And I would go into a lot of style, and that's the Plateresque, but I want to touch on a couple of larger themes here. First of all, much of it is meant to be temporary. What they're doing is they, for example, feel the need to build churches. The reason is you want to convert the indigenous population. You want to have some place to worship if you are one of the Spanish colonists. And so they're going to build these churches with the idea that they are either going to expand them or build something bigger later on. We see this at Ixmiquilpan, about 50 miles north of Mexico City, give or take. And here you can see where the original red brick structure is there, but then we have the add-on, the addition of the bell tower, and they widened the nave here, and in a very different style. So that's really, really common. The other thing that they're doing, especially with churches, is, for example, in the main cathedral in Mexico City, they're using it to show power. They want to show the indigenous population in as many ways as possible that they are now in power, that Christianity is now the religion of this land. And so they do so here, for example, by actually placing it within about a block. Here's the old Templo Mayor that we, I believe, discussed in the Aztec world. It's a block from there, and they use the stone from the Templo Mayor. All those facing stones are used for the facade and construction of the cathedral in Mexico City. So it's all about power and showing who's in charge in this time. Now, of course, we're going to have furniture as well. And as I've touched on, oftentimes what they're doing is they're bringing designs over and they're asking native artisans to create them. In this case, creating a wardrobe, an armoire form. And we have that very European cabriole leg on it. We've got a bit of sculpture or relief sculpting on the knee. We have a decorative foot. We have a Baroque form. If you ignore the paint for a minute, we have a Baroque form, especially if I added more relief ornamentation to it. But we are in the New World, so we don't have the great artisans of Europe coming over. Consequently, what you get are people bringing these designs to native artisans, and they're going to decorate it in the way that they understand, in this case with very native color schemes and forms. The idea of very bright, vibrant colors. And those doors are another example where a native artisan has been given probably a print showing this vase that the artisan has probably never seen, and these flowers that the artisan has probably never seen, especially things like tulips. And now he's being asked to paint them in here. So what you get is something that is an interesting hybrid mix, something that is somewhat three-dimensional, somewhat two-dimensional, somewhat Spanish and European, and in part very Aztec and indigenous. We will see other pieces too. More commonly, we'll see things like chairs and the utilitarian furniture of the time, but it's always going to be a little bit clumsy because these are not the methods that were traditionally used. So your indigenous artisan has to relearn a lot of new ideas. For example, they may not be used to something like lathe work and turned legs. They also tend to overbuild a lot of the colonial furniture, especially in Mexico, because they want this to last. They don't know how long this chair has to last before they can get a more appropriate chair. After all, this probably belongs to a conquistador or to one of his heirs or to someone who's Spanish. The indigenous population's not being given any of these things. In fact, they were seen as a subculture within Mexico really up through the 20th century.